The elevator door slid open with a quiet chime, and Simone stepped into the marble lobby she had walked through so many times before. Her heels tapped steadily on the polished floor, a sound she once found reassuring, but today it echoed differently, heavier somehow. The faces she passed told her everything. Guards who normally nodded politely avoided her eyes. Tellers whispered behind the glass like schoolchildren hiding a secret. Even the air seemed charged with something unspoken. She kept her stride measured, refusing to show nerves. A lifetime of holding her ground had taught her that fear only fed the people waiting to see it. Her leather portfolio was tucked under her arm, not just carrying documents but carrying months of quiet preparation. 6 months of recording conversations, noting small humiliations, filing away the coded phrases that had followed her through her career. Cultural fit. Not our way. Perhaps more suited elsewhere. She had learned long ago that these weren't simple phrases. They were warning shots, dressed in corporate politeness, meant to remind her that no matter how well she performed, she wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this lobby, not in this glass tower, not sitting in the chair at the head of the table upstairs. But she had kept her seat anyway, not by chance but by choice, and today she would see what that choice would cost. The brass plate on the elevator caught the morning light. Her name still gleamed there. Dr. Simone Washington, Chief Executive Officer. The words almost mocked her as she pressed the button for the 32nd floor. The ride gave her 90 seconds of silence, 90 seconds to breathe, to let her shoulders drop, to decide whether she would walk into the fire calmly or meet it with sparks of her own. When the doors opened, the hush in the executive suite was immediate. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Papers shuffled quickly as if the men in the boardroom didn't want her to see what they were reading. Through the windows, Chicago stretched wide and confident, a skyline of ambition. Inside, it felt more like a trap closing. She walked into the boardroom without rushing, without apology. The men waited there, silver hair, tailored suits, watches that could pay a month's salary for most of her employees. At the center, Chairman Richard Blackwell leaned back like he owned not just the room, but the city outside its windows. His voice came smooth and deliberate, sharpened to wound without appearing to. "You don't belong in our boardroom." The words landed with the force of something more than business. They were not about numbers or reports. They were about bloodlines, about ownership, about walls built generations before she ever dreamed of stepping inside. She gave no reaction, just a faint smile. One of those smiles that made men like Blackwell uncomfortable because they couldn't read it. Was it amusement? Was it defiance? Was it a secret? They hated not knowing. She took her seat at the head of the table anyway, where they didn't want her, where they believed she would never truly belong. The room itself was a reminder of who had built it. Dark wood panels, portraits of grim-faced men staring down from gold frames, an air that still smelled faintly of cigars smoked decades earlier. It was less a modern boardroom and more a gentleman's club disguised as business. She had chosen her outfit carefully that morning. A charcoal suit that was neat, professional, but simple enough not to trigger the inevitable accusation of arrogance. She carried her father's worn briefcase, scuffed at the corners, a relic of another man who had fought for respect in rooms that didn't want him. She opened it now and pulled out her tablet with steady hands. "Gentlemen," she said evenly, "shall we begin?" They barely acknowledged her. Blackwell kept his gaze on the skyline as though the city deserved more attention than she did. CFO Marcus Thompson glanced at his Rolex with exaggerated annoyance, making it clear that her time was considered less valuable. The director of risk management, James Patterson, pretended to shuffle papers, his way of showing indifference. It was all a performance, and she had grown used to reading the script. "We were discussing projections before you arrived," Thompson said smoothly, almost smirking, as though her presence was an intrusion on their club meeting. Simone didn't bother with a sigh or a frown. She tapped her tablet and the numbers filled the mounted screen. "Then you'll be pleased to know we exceeded projections by 18%. Customer satisfaction is at a 20-year high. Community lending is generating both goodwill and profit." The words should have been enough to silence anyone, but Patterson barely lifted his eyes. "Interesting numbers. But I do wonder about sustainability." His tone said more than the words. The disbelief wasn't about business. It was about her. Blackwell finally leaned forward, fixing her with eyes that carried decades of unchecked authority. Success is about more than numbers. It's about culture, fit, understanding the values that built this institution. There it was again, wrapped neatly in corporate language. Values, fit, culture. Words that had nothing to do with ledgers or profit sheets. Words that meant, you are not us. Simone clicked her phone screen under the table, starting the recording app she'd used so many times before. In her notebook she wrote the date, the time, and a single phrase, culture. I'd like to hear more about those values, she said softly. Her voice was steady silk, impossible to bend. The silence in the room stretched uncomfortably. Thompson drummed his fingers. Patterson shifted in his seat. Blackwell gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They thought she was cornered. What they didn't know was that she had been gathering every word, every slip, every whisper of what they truly thought for half a year. They thought they had all the cards, but Simone had been building her own hand quietly, piece by piece. The manila folder slid across the table with an almost casual motion, but Simone saw the weight in it before she even touched it. Anonymous complaints. Too aggressive in meetings. Doesn't collaborate with established team members. Brings politics into decisions. She read them calmly, though her pulse pressed harder in her veins. She looked up, her face composed, almost curious. Anonymous feedback is always tricky. Could you share some specifics so I can address them properly? Patterson finally perked up. The diversity hiring initiative, for example. Some felt it was divisive, focusing on race instead of qualifications. She closed the folder gently, as though it contained nothing of real substance. You mean the initiative that increased our talent pool by 40% and hired graduates from Harvard, Wharton, Stanford? The initiative directly tied to our increased profits. Blackwell waved a hand like she was a child chattering nonsense. It's not about resumes. It's about whether someone fits with the families who've trusted us for generations. Her pen moved across her notebook again. Families. Tradition. She let the words hang there in ink. The conversation moved in circles, each phrase less about facts and more about pushing her toward the corner where they wanted her. But she refused to stand there. Her posture remained upright, her tone calm. Every answer she gave wasn't just for the room, it was for the record she was building. By the time the clock neared 4, the tension in the air was brittle enough to snap. Blackwell stood with theatrical weight, moving to the window like an emperor surveying his kingdom. When he finally spoke, his words landed like a gavel. Dr. Washington, the board has made a decision regarding your position. Every pair of eyes turned toward her, waiting for her face to fall, for her voice to crack, for her to become what they always believed she was, temporary. But Simone only lifted her chin slightly, preparing for what she already knew was coming. We've decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately. The silence after was so sharp it almost hummed. Her nameplate still sat on the elevator downstairs. Her numbers were still glowing on the screen behind them. Her employees were still working in offices where she had doubled profits and expanded opportunities. And yet, in this room, they thought they had erased her with one sentence. She folded her hands on the table and waited for the next move. Simone didn't flinch. She simply leaned back slightly, the quiet poise in her body language enough to unsettle men who expected tears or outrage. Blackwell turned from the window, his pale blue eyes steady, his voice calm as if he had just announced the time of day. Your severance package is generous, considering the circumstances. 6 months' salary. A neutral reference. In exchange, you'll sign a non-disclosure agreement. Thompson slid a folder across the table toward her. The folder looked ordinary, but she understood exactly what it represented. Silence wrapped in legal pleasantries. Hush money. The price of pretending none of this ever happened. She placed her hands flat on the table but didn't touch it. She could almost hear them thinking, just sign, just go away, make it easy for all of us. Her eyes lifted slowly to meet Thompson's. The circumstances, she repeated. I'd like to hear more about what circumstances justify firing a CEO who delivered record profits, record customer satisfaction, and expanded this bank into 3 new markets in under 2 years. The edge in her voice made Patterson clear his throat uncomfortably. He was the weakest of the 3, more follower than leader. Still, he tried to sound firm. It isn't about numbers, Dr. Washington. It's about leadership style, cultural compatibility. The board feels your approach does not align with our institutional values. She let the words hang in the air. Institutional values. She had been hearing that phrase in one form or another her entire career, from graduate school to her first analyst job. It was the polite veil pulled over exclusion, the invisible wall dressed in corporate jargon. She kept her tone steady, such as, that simple question made Blackwell's jaw tighten. He hated having to explain himself. He walked back to the table with deliberate steps and sat heavily in his chair. Loyalty to tradition, respect for established practices, understanding that some methods don't need modernization for the sake of political correctness. The words landed exactly as she expected, and her pen scratched across her notebook. Political correctness, Blackwell, 3:47 p.m. Her phone, still recording, lay face down by her folder. Every syllable was being captured. Every mask slipping was being preserved. Thompson leaned forward, adopting a tone meant to sound fatherly but dripping with condescension. You're a bright woman, Dr. Washington. Talented. But perhaps you'd be more comfortable at an institution that better reflects your perspective. She didn't blink. She didn't argue. She simply reached into her purse and pulled out her company credit card, her building access badge, and her laptop. She placed them neatly on the table, one by one, the sound of each item a small but deliberate reminder that she wasn't clinging to anything. Then she folded her hands again. I understand, she said softly, but there was something underneath her tone, something that made Blackwell's eyes narrow just slightly. Before I leave, though, I assume you'll want a proper transition of my responsibilities. Federal banking regulations require complete documentation of executive transitions. I'd be glad to ensure those records are prepared. The room shifted. Patterson waved a hand dismissively. That won't be necessary. The board will handle the transition. Her smile appeared almost kind, but it was sharp enough to draw blood. Oh, but it is necessary. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to explain to regulators why a major leadership change wasn't documented properly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. For the first time, the certainty in their expressions wavered. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice even calm, almost casual. By the way, who will be taking responsibility for the Henderson account during this transition? Confusion flashed briefly across Patterson's face before he answered too quickly. The trust department will handle it. Simone tilted her head as though concerned. That's interesting. The Henderson Trust requires executive oversight. Mrs. Henderson made it very clear to me that any change in management would trigger a full portfolio review. You are aware of that, yes? The silence that followed wasn't the smug silence from earlier. It was the silence of unease, of realization that she wasn't leaving them with an easy handoff. She let the pause linger, then continued. And the Patel Group, the Morrison Family Trust, the Chun Foundation, they all have similar provisions. I imagine they'll want to discuss these changes directly with leadership. Dropping each name felt like setting down heavy stones. With each one, the weight on the board members' faces grew. She could see it in Thompson's jaw tightening, in Patterson's restless hands. Blackwell kept his expression still, but the color in his face had shifted ever so slightly. Dr. Washington, he said finally, his voice hardening. Are you threatening us? Her eyebrows rose, her smile faint and unreadable. Threatening? No. I'm simply making sure our clients remain fully informed. Surely that's what you'd want. Even as she spoke, her phone buzzed quietly against the table. She didn't check it, but she knew what it was. Her allies had been waiting for this moment. She had sent a single text before entering the room. It's time. What the men around her didn't know was that she had spent months preparing not just for this meeting, but for every possible outcome. Every insult, every attempt to push her out, every coded word they thought they could use safely, she had captured it all. Her network was ready, her records were organized, her next moves already set in motion. The glass walls of the boardroom were supposed to represent transparency, but they now felt more like a stage. Employees had begun to notice the presence of security guards outside. Some had stopped in the hallway, whispering, glancing through the glass. A few had pulled out their phones. Word was already spreading, the way it always did in a financial district where gossip moved faster than stock prices. Blackwell leaned back again, but this time there was no smug authority in his posture. There was only the faintest flicker of doubt. He had believed that this meeting would be clean, quiet, final. What he was beginning to sense, though he didn't yet know the full extent, was that he had just opened a door he couldn't close. The sound of the security guard's heavy steps outside the boardroom door broke the moment. Blackwell turned toward them with theatrical ease, raising his voice so everyone in the room could hear. "Gentlemen, please escort Dr. Washington from the building. Ensure she doesn't access any files on her way out." The word escort cut through Simone like a blade. She had seen this pattern before. The black executive framed as a security threat, the image of her being walked out by guards meant to humiliate, to remind everyone that her presence here had been temporary. She stood slowly, her movements graceful, refusing to give them the satisfaction of haste. "That won't be necessary," she said quietly. "But I will insist we follow every protocol required by law." Thompson gave a laugh that was too loud, too forced. "Federal law? We've been complying with regulations since before you were born." The insult landed exactly as he intended, but Simone's smile didn't waver. She slipped her phone into her portfolio, making sure the recording continued. She had no interest in arguing anymore. She was simply waiting for the pieces she'd set in motion to fall into place. Because while they thought this was the end of her career, Simone knew the truth. It was the beginning of theirs unraveling. And even as the guards shifted uncertainly by the door, unsure if they were escorting a threat or walking into the middle of something much larger, the balance in the room had already begun to change. The guards hesitated in the doorway, their broad shoulders filling the glass frame, their presence heavy with unspoken accusation. They didn't move right away, though. Something in the room felt different now, a tension that even they seemed reluctant to cut through. Simone remained standing, her posture calm, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. She looked more like the one in control than the men trying to push her out. Blackwell motioned impatiently at the guards, but they only shifted their weight from one foot to the other, their eyes darting toward the hallway. Outside the glass walls, clusters of employees had stopped pretending to work. They were gathering in groups, whispering, glancing toward the boardroom, some raising their phones to discreetly record. The sight of security guards summoned to escort the bank's first black CEO had stirred something no one could ignore. Simone let the silence stretch before she spoke again. "Before you ask anyone to escort me anywhere, I think we should talk about the Henderson account more carefully, and perhaps the Patel Group, and the Chun Foundation. You do understand that mishandling those accounts could trigger immediate reviews not only from clients but from federal regulators." Her voice was calm, but the words hit like stones thrown into still water, rippling out in every direction. Patterson's eyes darted nervously toward Blackwell. Thompson shifted in his seat, his smirk gone. Blackwell's jaw set tighter, but his silence was telling. It was at that moment the boardroom door opened, not with the force of security, but with a firm knock and the quiet step of Patricia Chun, head of human resources. Her usual composure was strained. She looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, but duty forced her forward. She held a tablet in her hand, the screen already lit up with the document. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice low but firm, "I need to speak with you about proper procedures for executive transitions." Blackwell's irritation was obvious. "Patricia, this is a board matter. Please return to your office." But she didn't move. She set the tablet on the table and tapped the screen. "Our employment council strongly advises all executive terminations be reviewed for compliance with federal law before action is taken." Thompson snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. "Dr. Washington's employment is at will. We can terminate her for any reason or no reason." The words hung in the air like smoke spreading quickly, impossible to pull back. Patricia's eyes widened slightly as if she knew immediately what those words meant in this context. Through the glass, employees who had gathered close enough to hear stirred, their faces registering shock. Any reason or no reason. That phrase, spoken in a boardroom full of white men against the bank's first black female CEO, wasn't just poor wording. It was ammunition. Simone let her silence do the work. She didn't need to argue. Her phone, still recording, had captured it all. The look on Patricia's face told her everything. Someone else in the room understood exactly how damning that sentence was. The crowd outside grew larger. Phones were now openly held up, recording, photographing, documenting. In today's world, moments like this didn't stay private. They spread like fire, leaping from one device to another, across networks, into the hands of journalists and advocates. And then, cutting through the murmurs outside, a voice called clearly, "Dr. Washington, is it true they're terminating you?" The boardroom froze. Everyone turned toward the glass. Marcus Rodriguez, a rising star in commercial lending, stood on the other side. Young, ambitious, one of Simone's key hires. His expression was a mix of disbelief and anger. He didn't move when security turned toward him. He only stood straighter, waiting for an answer. "This is a private meeting," Patterson barked, his voice rising. "Return to your desk immediately or face disciplinary action." The words snapped across the room, but instead of shrinking back, Marcus stayed put. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, Sarah Kim from the trust department stepped forward. David Johnson from commercial real estate. Dr. Amamira Hassan from international banking. All high performers. All people Simone had recruited. All standing silently now, but their presence spoke volumes. "Mr. Thompson," Patricia interjected quickly, her voice sharp with warning, "I strongly advise against making any statements that could be construed as retaliatory." "I don't need advice from you either," Thompson shot back, his face flushed. He slammed his palm against the table. "This is a board decision, and everyone else needs to remember their place." The air changed. Those 3 words, "remember their place," echoed louder than his shout. Outside, the employees drew in sharp breaths. Inside, Simone saw the weight of them land on every face. Every person who knew exactly what place was being referenced. The condescension, the history behind those words was undeniable. Simone remained still, almost detached, watching the collapse of their carefully built facade. Every careless word, every flash of temper, every slur hidden behind polite phrases was unraveling now under the heat of witnesses and recording devices. She didn't need to argue anymore. The men were undoing themselves. Through the glass, movement caught her eye, news vans pulling up outside on the street below. Cameras already being set up on tripods. Chicago's financial district never stayed quiet for long. A story like this, an all-white board firing a successful black female CEO, was bound to travel fast. Blackwell noticed the commotion outside as well. His face went pale as he realized how far this had spiraled in less than an hour. What was meant to be a quiet removal was already turning into a spectacle, one that could not be contained behind glass walls. "How did they?" he began, his voice cracking for the first time. Simone let the faintest smile curve her lips. "Social media. It spreads faster than tradition." The guards shifted uneasily. They weren't sure if they were supposed to remove her anymore. Not with half the floor watching, not with cameras outside, not with the room itself slipping out of the board's control. And just as the tension reached a breaking point, the elevator chimed. Every head turned. The doors opened slowly, and out stepped 3 figures. A woman in a dark suit, 2 associates behind her carrying bankers' boxes. The woman's presence was unmistakable. Sarah Chun, one of the most feared civil rights attorneys in the Midwest. Her voice cut through the room like a blade. "Gentlemen, I'm here representing Dr. Washington in what appears to be a discriminatory termination proceeding." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time all morning, the power in the room shifted unmistakably. And Simone, standing tall with her portfolio in hand, knew the game had only just begun. Sarah Chun didn't waste a second. She strode into the boardroom as if it belonged to her, her black suit crisp, her hair pinned neatly, her expression unreadable. Behind her, 2 associates set the bankers' boxes on the table with deliberate precision. The red light on Simone's recorder blinked steadily, almost like a heartbeat marking the moment. "Discriminatory termination proceeding?" Blackwell repeated, his voice rough. "This is a private board decision. You have no standing here." Sarah's eyes flicked toward him, sharp and dismissive, like she had been in 100 rooms just like this one and dismantled 100 men just like him. "You'll find I have plenty of standing. Especially since Dr. Washington has already recorded 47 minutes of this meeting, including your explicit language around culture, political correctness, and what was it? Employees knowing their place." Thompson's face went red, the color creeping up his neck. "She can't record private board meetings. That's entrapment." "Actually," Sarah replied smoothly, her voice cutting through his protest. Illinois is a one-party consent state. She was legally entitled to record any conversation she participated in. More importantly, as CEO, she had a fiduciary duty to document potential misconduct by her board, which, judging by what I've heard already, she has done exceptionally well. Patterson shifted in his seat like the chair had suddenly turned into a fire. This is outrageous. We don't have to. Sarah lifted a hand, silencing him without raising her voice. One of her associates opened a banker's box and pulled out a thick folder, stamped and labeled, Washington Holdings, LLC. The weight of the paper seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Gentlemen, Sarah said, sliding the folder across the polished table, before you proceed with any more mistakes, you should understand who exactly you are attempting to remove. Blackwell hesitated before opening the folder. His eyes skimmed the documents, his frown deepening with every page. Thompson leaned over, his mouth falling open slightly. Patterson blinked hard, as though trying to make sense of words that didn't match the picture in his head. Through Washington Holdings, Sarah continued evenly, Dr. Washington is the largest individual shareholder of Liberty First Bank. She controls 35% of its equity. In other words, gentlemen, you do not simply work with her. You work for her. The silence was deafening. Even the guards at the door shifted, their expressions confused. Thompson's voice broke first, stammering. This is impossible. We would have known. Would you? Sarah asked, her tone sharp but calm. Because according to your own legal counsel, she opened another folder and slid out a memo stamped with the bank's logo. You were advised 6 months ago that any personnel decisions regarding Dr. Washington required full shareholder review. It was received, signed, and initialed by all three of you. She tapped the signatures on the page, each one in black ink. Blackwell. Thompson. Patterson. Patterson leaned forward, his face pale, his hands trembling. We thought the family trust. Oh, you thought wrong, Sarah interrupted smoothly. The ownership had already transferred. You knew it. You just didn't care. And you've left a paper trail a mile wide proving it. Simone hadn't spoken yet, hadn't needed to. She simply watched, calm, her eyes steady as her attorney dismantled the men piece by piece. Sarah wasn't finished. And then there are the emails, she said, sliding her tablet onto the table and tapping the screen. Words projected onto the room's monitor. Words the men had written to each other over the past year. Words like uppity. Words like not our kind of people. Words like overstepping boundaries. The room went still, the only sound the faint hum of the air system above. Blackwell's face drained of color. Thompson looked like he might be sick. Patterson whispered, Dear God. Outside the glass walls, employees pressed closer, their faces a mix of shock and grim satisfaction. Phones tilted upward, capturing everything. The images of those words projected on the screen would travel far beyond this boardroom. They would be seen in living rooms, classrooms, news broadcasts, courtrooms. Blackwell finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a rasp. This changes things. Perhaps we were hasty. Hasty. Simone spoke at last, her voice calm, precise. Mr. Blackwell, you've spent the last hour explaining to me that I don't belong here, that I don't fit your culture, that I should find somewhere else, somewhere more suitable for my kind. And now you want to call it hasty. Her words cut deeper than any legal citation. The board members sat frozen, men who had never been told no by anyone who mattered suddenly realizing that they were no longer the ones holding the cards. And then came the final blow. Sarah nodded to her associate, who pulled out another set of documents. Dr. Washington, she said, is also the daughter of the late Senator Marcus Washington, one of this bank's founding figures. His estate still holds influence over the charter and federal licenses that allow Liberty First Bank to operate. Which means, gentlemen, your attempt to remove her isn't just discriminatory. It's suicidal. The revelation cracked something in the room. Thompson slumped in his chair, his breathing quick and shallow. Patterson rubbed his forehead with shaking hands. Blackwell stared at the documents as though willing them to vanish. Outside, the employees erupted into murmurs. Some pressed their hands to the glass, others raised their phones higher. Down on the street, the news vans had multiplied. Reporters were already speaking into cameras, their words lost in the glass but their presence undeniable. Simone let the moment breathe before she spoke again. Her voice quiet but carrying. Gentlemen, I think we need to have a very different conversation about the future of this institution. It wasn't a request. It was a verdict. Through the window, she could see the crowd gathering on the street below, signs already beginning to rise. Justice for Dr. Washington. End banking discrimination. Her name, her face, her fight. They were no longer just inside this boardroom. They had spilled into the city, into the world. The board members sat in silence, surrounded by evidence of their prejudice, their arrogance, their downfall. And Simone, standing at the head of the table where they had tried to erase her, knew this was the turning point. They thought they had buried her. They didn't realize she was the foundation. The storm had only just begun. The boardroom had become a fishbowl. The glass walls that once kept power private now exposed everything to the eyes outside. Employees weren't pretending to work anymore. They stood shoulder to shoulder, some with phones recording, others with arms crossed, their expressions a mix of anger and disbelief. Down on the street, news cameras tilted upward, catching the 32nd floor like hunters waiting for their prey to stumble into sight. Simone stayed standing. She didn't need to raise her voice. The room was hers now. I think we should revisit this idea of transition. Because from where I stand, it appears Liberty First Bank is facing a crisis not of performance, but of leadership. Her words landed with quiet force. Thompson's face flushed again. He slammed his palm on the table so hard the water glasses rattled. This is becoming a circus. Security, clear that hallway immediately. Remove those employees before this goes any further. The guards hesitated again, exchanging uncertain glances. To them, this wasn't a simple order. They weren't just removing idle staff anymore. They'd be dragging away people who had done nothing more than watch their CEO being humiliated. Doing that in full view of cameras and phones? That wasn't security work. That was optics. Bad optics. One of the guards shifted his weight. Sir, with all due respect. He trailed off, unsure of how to finish without making things worse. Thompson's face twisted. Do your job or... Mr. Thompson, Patricia Chun interrupted, her voice taut but steady. You're giving orders that can and will be construed as retaliatory against employees who are simply observing. If any action is taken against them, this bank will be exposed to massive liability. I strongly advise you stop talking. Her words cracked through the air, and for a moment Thompson froze, realizing too late he'd already said too much. Simone didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply watched the implosion unfold, as though she'd been expecting every word before it left his mouth. And then the inevitable push came from outside. The glass door swung open and Marcus Rodriguez stepped inside the boardroom, his phone still in his hand. Behind him came Sarah Kim, her eyes flashing, then David Johnson, tall and unyielding, then Dr. Amamira Hassan. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. Their presence said enough. Dr. Washington, Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying. Is it true? Are they firing you? The question echoed in the silence, a single spark in a room already soaked in fuel. Blackwell's face flushed crimson. This is a private matter, he barked. Return to your departments immediately or face disciplinary action. But Marcus didn't budge. He wasn't a junior analyst anymore. He had built portfolios, closed deals, delivered revenue. And more importantly, he had witnessed what Simone had built. An institution that had finally opened its doors to people like him. With respect, sir, he said firmly, this isn't just about departments. It's about the future of this bank. Blackwell opened his mouth, but Simone spoke first, her tone even, deliberate. Marcus, Sarah, David, Amamira, thank you. But let me handle this. They looked at her, each of them searching her face for a signal. She gave them the faintest nod, a reassurance that she wasn't breaking, that she wasn't alone. They stepped back but didn't leave. They stood along the wall like sentinels, silent witnesses who refused to disappear. The cameras outside zoomed in closer. Reporters spoke with more urgency. The boardroom wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was becoming a stage. And the audience was growing by the minute. Patterson leaned forward, his voice cracking under the strain. This is not how business is done. Sarah Chun, the attorney, cut him off coolly. No, Mr. Patterson. This is exactly how business is done when discrimination meets accountability. You wanted a closed-door execution. Instead, you've created a public reckoning. As if on cue, another phone buzzed loudly on the table. Blackwell glanced down. His expression tightened. It wasn't just messages from colleagues. It was alerts from financial journalists, regulators, maybe even government offices. Simone could see it in his eyes. The world outside had already caught fire. She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm as water. "Gentlemen, I warned you about reputation. You thought you could bury me quietly. But you've underestimated something important. Transparency isn't optional anymore. It's already out there. Right now, people are reading about Liberty First Bank and asking questions you don't want to answer." Blackwell looked out the window, his lips pressed tight. On the street below, a crowd had gathered. Not just reporters but protesters carrying hastily scrawled signs. "Justice for Dr. Washington. Stop banking discrimination." Someone held up her photo. The chants hadn't begun yet, but the energy was building. Patterson's hand shook as he reached for his glass of water. "This is spiraling out of control." Sarah Chen's lips curved faintly, though her tone remained professional. "Out of your control, perhaps, but very much in Dr. Washington's." The sound of more buzzing filled the room as every board member's phone lit up at once. Blackwell frowned, swiping at his screen. His face drained of color. Thompson's phone buzzed too, then Patterson's. "What is this?" Thompson muttered, scrolling. Sarah Chun leaned forward, her voice crisp. "That would be the Securities and Exchange Commission. Copied to the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago and the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. A formal notice of investigation into potential violations of employment law, corporate governance, and banking regulations." Blackwell's hand froze around his phone. His voice was hoarse. You contacted them?" Simone finally smiled, her first true smile of the day. "No, Mr. Blackwell. They contacted me." It was the moment the balance fully shifted. The men who had sat smug and untouchable an hour ago were now pale, sweating, their empire collapsing under the weight of their own arrogance. The glass walls that once symbolized strength now exposed them as weak, scrambling, cornered. Sarah Chen's associate clicked open the next banker's box and set down a small recorder, its red light blinking. "For the record," she said, her tone precise, "we have documented every discriminatory statement, every retaliatory threat, and every coded phrase used during this meeting. This will be presented as evidence if necessary." Thompson swallowed hard, his voice shaking. This is entrapment." "She can't." "She can," Sarah interrupted sharply. "And she did. And now you'll answer for it." Simone watched them quietly, her calmness only growing as their certainty fell apart. The men shifted, desperate for a way out, but there wasn't one. On the street below, the chants began. Faint at first, then louder. Her name rising up 32 stories of glass and steel. Inside the boardroom, every face turned toward her, no longer with dismissal, but with something closer to fear. And she knew, the reckoning had begun. The chanting rose from the street in steady waves, carried through the glass walls like the rhythm of a drum. 32 stories below, the crowd had swelled, a living pulse of people, signs, and cameras. What began as whispers among employees had become a movement visible to the entire city. Inside the boardroom, the men who had built their careers on tradition and secrecy now sat exposed, trapped in the glare of public eyes and the unforgiving buzz of their own phones. Blackwell's hand trembled as he scrolled through message after message. Emails from regulators, texts from allies begging for explanation, news alerts reporting a breaking story that hadn't even finished unfolding. Sarah Chun tapped the recorder lightly with her manicured nail, the red light blinking like a heartbeat. 47 minutes of discrimination, gentlemen. Every threat, every attempt to silence her, preserved and protected. And now, federal regulators are listening. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the HVAC and the chants outside growing louder, angrier. Then, without warning, the elevator chimed again. All eyes turned as the doors slid open. 3 men in dark suits stepped out, followed by a woman carrying a folder with a federal seal on the front. Their presence was quiet but commanding, the kind of arrival that made every employee in sight step back. "Good afternoon," the woman said as she entered the boardroom, Her voice clipped, professional. I'm with the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. We're here to begin an immediate review of Liberty First Bank's compliance with federal regulations. Blackwell's face drained. This is highly irregular. Sir, she interrupted without raising her voice. Irregular is when a sitting CEO is removed in a board meeting full of documented discriminatory remarks, while your employees record everything and the story trends nationwide. We've been monitoring since the first post hit social media. Her words landed like stones dropped into water, each one spreading ripples of finality. Thompson rubbed his temples, sweat glistening at his hairline. Patterson sagged in his chair, his eyes darting anywhere but at Simone. Sarachan stepped aside, making room at the table for the regulators. I'll let you gentlemen and lady proceed. Dr. Washington has nothing to hide. The woman in the dark suit opened her folder, sliding out a stack of documents. We'll need immediate access to board communications, employment files, and any materials related to the termination decision. Simone watched quietly as the men stiffened. They were cornered now, and the walls of the glass fishbowl were closing in. Blackwell tried to speak again, but his voice faltered. Perhaps we should recess until tomorrow. No, the regulator said firmly. This begins now. From the hallway, more employees edged closer, their phones raised. The regulators didn't shoo them away. They let the transparency stand. It was no longer just a board matter. It was a matter of public trust. Simone finally sat again, her movements steady, her presence unshaken. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The very stillness of her body carried more authority than their sputtering words. Dr. Washington, the regulator asked, turning toward her with professional respect. Do you have any documentation relevant to today's events? Simone slid her notebook across the table, her handwriting neat, each entry marked with time and date. 6 months' worth. Every coded phrase. Every retaliation. Every attempt to undermine my leadership. She then set her phone beside it, the red light still blinking. And as you can hear, a full audio record of this meeting. The regulators nodded. Thank you. That will be entered into the review. Thompson leaned forward suddenly, desperation leaking into his voice. Look, this is all being blown out of proportion. We never intended. Intent, Sarachan cut in sharply, is irrelevant when the evidence shows discrimination. You can't excuse coded racism by calling it poor phrasing. The record speaks for itself. Her words left no room for reply. On the street below, the chanting shifted, growing louder, more urgent. Justice now. Justice now. The sound carried upward, vibrating through the glass. For a moment, the entire building seemed to hum with it. The federal woman gathered the first stack of documents and placed them carefully in her folder. Then she looked directly at Blackwell. Until this review is complete, you are not authorized to remove Dr. Washington from her position. Any action taken against her will be considered obstruction of a federal investigation. It was the moment the ground beneath the men gave way completely. Blackwell sat back heavily, his face gray. Patterson looked down at the table as though hoping it would swallow him. Thompson buried his face in his hands. Simone's voice broke the silence, calm but clear. Gentlemen, I told you this wasn't about performance. It wasn't about numbers. It was about power and who you thought deserved it. You wanted me gone because you couldn't stand the idea of someone like me leading this institution. But here's the truth you never wanted to face. You don't own me. You never did. Her words carried not just to the table, but through the glass to every employee watching, to every camera capturing, to every voice waiting outside. The federal regulators began gathering documents, speaking quietly to Sarachan, who handed over the evidence with practiced efficiency. The guards who had once been summoned to escort Simone out now stood awkwardly, clearly unsure where they fit in this new order. Then came the final fracture. One of Sarah's associates opened a banker's box and pulled out a stack of printed emails, direct correspondence between the board members. Words like "not our kind of people." Words like "she'll never last here." Words dripping with entitlement, arrogance, and bias. The regulator's eyes scanned them briefly before she placed them in her folder. This will be sufficient for preliminary review. Blackwell's head dropped into his hands. His empire, his legacy, his power all collapsing in real time. Simone rose again, her calmness like steel wrapped in velvet. She gathered her portfolio, tucked her father's briefcase under her arm, and looked around the room. The same men who had once dismissed her now avoided her eyes. She wasn't erased. She wasn't escorted out. She was standing exactly where she had always belonged, at the center of the institution she had built, leading through storms meant to break her. The chanting outside surged louder, echoing through the boardroom. For the first time all day, Simone let herself breathe fully. The battle wasn't over, not yet. But the tide had turned. And as the regulators closed their folders and prepared to begin their interviews, Simone knew this was no longer about survival. It was about transformation. The reckoning was here. The investigators settled into the boardroom as though it had become their office. Laptops opened, folders stacked, pens clicked. The formality of their movements left no doubt. This was no courtesy review. This was the beginning of something heavy, something the board couldn't spin away. The hum of the city outside and the chants from the street below seeped in like a constant reminder that their empire was no longer private. Blackwell sat stiffly, his arms crossed, but the fight had gone out of his posture. He looked less like a man in charge, and more like someone trying to keep his balance on a ship that was already sinking. Thompson leaned forward with a kind of manic energy, as if speaking quickly enough might outrun the damage. Patterson just stared down at his glass of water, his hand trembling slightly every time he lifted it. "Mr. Blackwell," one of the investigators began, "we'll need your personal correspondence related to Dr. Washington's employment. Emails, text messages, any notes or communications." Blackwell's jaw worked, but he didn't speak. The investigator's gaze didn't waver. Now, slowly, almost reluctantly, Blackwell reached for his phone and slid it across the table. The simple act felt like a surrender. Thompson and Patterson followed, though their hands lingered too long, as though letting go of those devices meant letting go of the little control they had left. Meanwhile, outside the glass, employees pressed closer. Some had tears in their eyes, others looks of pure defiance. Simone recognized faces she'd interviewed herself, bright young people who'd taken a chance on liberty first because she made it seem like a place worth belonging to. Now they stood witness to her fight, their phones raised, capturing a truth too large to hide anymore. Simone's attorney Sarah leaned slightly toward her, her voice low. "This is bigger than today. They've built a case against themselves that regulators and lawyers will be tearing apart for months, maybe years." Simone nodded, but her eyes never left the board members. "They thought silence would keep me safe. What they didn't realize was silence was never protection. It was their weapon. I just refused to keep carrying it." One of the investigators glanced up. "Dr. Washington, do you have additional evidence beyond today's meeting?" Without hesitation, Simone opened her leather portfolio and slid forward a flash drive. "Every conversation I've documented over the last 6 months. Dates, times, names. Patterns of exclusion, coded language, deliberate obstruction. It's all here." The investigator accepted it with a nod. "This will be entered into the official record." A groan escaped Thompson's lips before he could catch it. "This is madness. You're going to destroy the bank." Simone turned toward him, her tone calm but laced with iron. "No, Mr. Thompson. You were willing to destroy the bank the moment you decided your pride mattered more than performance. You thought tradition meant keeping the door locked. I thought it meant building a stronger house. Look around. Which one of us delivered results?" Her words left him speechless. The chants from outside rose again, this time joined by car horns echoing from the street below. The regulators exchanged glances, understanding that the spectacle unfolding here wasn't just legal. It was cultural, political, generational. Patterson finally found his voice, though it was thin and frayed. "This isn't fair. You're turning everything into race." The room went still, even the hum of conversation outside seeming to hush. Simone leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the table. Her eyes locked on his. "Mr. Patterson, you've sat in this chair for decades without ever wondering if fairness was in the room with you. Today, for the first time, you're being held accountable. That isn't race. That's reality." He looked down, unable to hold her gaze. The lead investigator tapped her pen against her notepad. "Gentlemen, this review will extend into your individual conduct. Personal liability is a very real possibility here. You may want to consider securing separate legal counsel. The color drained from Thompson's face. Personal liability? You can't be serious. But Sarah Chun cut in smoothly. Very serious. Discriminatory practices at the executive level are violations of equal employment law, fair lending statutes, and fiduciary duty. That isn't just policy. That's federal law. And federal law doesn't care about your country club traditions. For the first time all afternoon, Simone allowed herself to sit back, her body relaxing into the chair that had always been hers. She no longer felt like she was clinging to it. She felt like she was owning it. Through the glass she saw employees raising their fists in quiet solidarity, young faces lit with something like hope. She caught Marcus's eyes. He gave her the faintest nod, a promise that the younger generation had her back. The investigators continued their questioning, moving methodically, stripping away any illusion of power the board once held. Each answer from the men dug their hole deeper. Each silence spoke louder than their words. Finally, the lead investigator closed her folder. Until this investigation concludes, Dr. Washington remains in full capacity as CEO. Any attempt to obstruct her duties will be considered interference with a federal review. The statement was simple, but it landed like thunder. Simone didn't move, didn't smile. She simply inclined her head slightly. Thank you. Blackwell exhaled heavily, his hands flat on the table, his eyes distant. The man who once told her she didn't belong in their boardroom now looked like a guest in hers. Simone rose slowly, smoothing the front of her suit. Gentlemen, I think our meeting is finished for today. Unless, of course, you'd like to discuss quarterly projections. Her calmness stung more than any insult. She turned and walked to the glass door, her heels steady, her back straight. As she opened it, the crowd outside erupted in cheers. Phones flashed. Voices rose. Employees reached for her hand as she passed, some whispering, "We've got you." Others simply nodding, their eyes wet but fierce. Down on the street, the chants grew deafening. The city itself seemed to have joined in, echoing her name against the skyline. She walked through it all without hurrying, her father's briefcase swinging gently at her side. For the first time in months, the weight she carried didn't feel like a burden. It felt like proof. Proof that dignity held steady even under fire. Behind her, the boardroom remained full of pale faces, hollow eyes, and federal investigators who weren't leaving anytime soon. Ahead of her, the path wasn't easy, but it was hers. And she knew. They hadn't ended her story. They had only given it power. The noise from the street rolled upward in waves as Simone stepped out of the glass boardroom. Employees parted instinctively, their eyes fixed on her, some smiling through tears, others lifting their phones to record the moment they knew was history. For months, whispers had carried through these halls, about whether she'd last, about whether she fit. Now the whispers were gone. What remained was a visible shift in air. A collective realization that the woman they tried to erase had just become unstoppable. Marcus Rodriguez fell into step beside her. He didn't say much, just a quiet, "We're with you, Dr. Washington." Behind him, Sarah Kim and David Johnson followed, their presence less about protection and more about solidarity. Simone gave each of them a small nod. She didn't need to speak gratitude. They already understood. Down the corridor, more employees were waiting. Some clapped softly as she passed. Others simply looked at her with a kind of reverence that comes when someone fights a battle you know is also yours. A young teller, barely out of college, face still nervous in a world that often ate people like her alive, murmured, "Thank you," as Simone walked by. Outside, the chants intensified, spilling through the revolving doors and into the lobby. Security, once summoned to escort her out, now stood awkwardly by, their eyes flicking between the crowd and Simone. They weren't moving against her anymore. They couldn't. The tide had shifted too far. By the time Simone reached the front entrance, reporters had gathered in a throng, microphones extended, voices clamoring over each other. "Dr. Washington, do you still consider yourself CEO? Are you planning legal action? How do you respond to the board's decision?" Simone paused at the top of the steps. Cameras flashed. The crowd pressed closer. She lifted her hand slightly and the noise quieted. Not completely, but enough. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I have always considered myself CEO," she said, each word steady, unshaken. Today the board tried to tell me I didn't belong. But belonging isn't theirs to give or take away. I was chosen by results, not tradition. And I will continue to serve the employees, the clients, and the community that put their trust in Liberty First Bank. The crowd erupted, cheers from employees mixed with chants from protesters. Reporters shouted more questions, but Simone didn't linger. She turned back inside, escorted not by guards but by her people. On the 32nd floor, the regulators were still at work, the board members pale and cornered. Sarah Chun remained seated at the table, her associates methodically cataloging evidence. She looked up as Simone re-entered, her eyes sharp but approving. They've already backed themselves into a corner. It's only a matter of time before they start negotiating for survival. Simone placed her briefcase gently on the table and sat again at the head. Her calmness unnerved the men across from her more than shouting ever could. "Mr. Blackwell," she said softly, "you built this institution on tradition. But today you proved tradition without accountability is nothing but rot. You wanted to silence me, but all you've done is give my voice an audience you cannot contain." Blackwell's lips parted, but no words came. He lowered his gaze to the table. For the next 2 hours, the regulators interviewed each man separately. Their answers were clipped, defensive, sometimes contradictory. The employees outside didn't disperse. They stayed, a living wall of witnesses. Word spread quickly across the financial district, then across the country. By evening, Liberty First Bank wasn't just trending locally. It was headline news. National outlets ran with the story. Black CEO ousted by all-white board amid record profits. Employees protest board's attempted termination. Federal investigators descend on Liberty First Bank. The spin Blackwell once relied on couldn't keep up. Reporters dug into the bank's history, unearthing patterns of exclusion, old lawsuits, whispers of redlining practices. Everything the board wanted hidden now burned under a spotlight they couldn't dim. Back inside, Simone worked steadily. She called her executive assistant, ensuring ongoing projects remained undisturbed. She answered questions from regulators with precision, offering data points, memos, proof of her leadership. She moved through the storm like she had been training for it her whole life. As the sky darkened outside, Patricia Chun entered quietly with an update. "Dr. Washington, employees have organized a vigil in the plaza. They're lighting candles, holding signs. They say they're not leaving until they know you're safe in your position." Simone exhaled slowly, the weight of that loyalty pressing deep. "Tell them I see them. Tell them their courage is the reason I can stand here today." Patricia nodded, her composure breaking just slightly as she blinked back emotion. Later, when the regulators finally adjourned for the evening, the board members were left hollow. Blackwell's voice cracked as he tried one last time to reclaim control. "Dr. Washington, what is it you want?" She stood, gathering her papers carefully. Her answer was simple. "What I have always wanted. A bank that serves all of its people with dignity. Whether you choose to be part of that future is no longer my concern. The law will decide your part. The people will decide mine." She walked out without waiting for their reply. That night, the plaza outside the bank was lit with hundreds of candles. Employees stood side by side with community members, students, activists. Some prayed aloud. Others sang softly. Many simply held their phones high, broadcasting live to anyone willing to watch. Simone stood at the window of her office looking down at them. For the first time in years, she felt something deeper than resilience. She felt proof that the fight wasn't just hers. Behind her on her desk, the thank you letter she'd saved over the years seemed to take on new meaning. Notes from first-time homeowners. Messages from small business owners who'd finally received loans. Faces of employees who'd once been told no elsewhere, but who'd found yes under her leadership. She touched the edge of her father's old briefcase, remembering how he told her once, "Respect isn't given to us in those rooms, Simone. We carve it out, inch by inch, until the walls can't hold us anymore." Tonight, the walls hadn't just cracked. They had collapsed. And tomorrow she knew the rebuilding would begin on her terms. 6 months later, the boardroom looked nothing like it had the day Simone walked in to find her name under attack. The heavy portraits of stern-faced founders still hung on the walls, but now they were joined by new photographs, images of loan ceremonies in neighborhoods once denied, scholarship checks handed to first-generation college students, ribbon cuttings at small businesses funded through community programs. The dark wood table remained, but around it sat a different mix of faces. Younger, more diverse, sharper. The conversations that once reeked of golf handicaps and old money now carried the cadence of ideas, possibilities, and accountability. Simone stood at the tall windows overlooking Chicago, the same one she'd stared through on the day of her so-called termination. Outside, the skyline stretched across the horizon, glittering in the late afternoon light. But this view felt different now. It wasn't a cage. It was a promise. Liberty First Bank had not crumbled as the old guard predicted. Instead, it flourished. Profits had surged 60% under policies the board once dismissed as social messaging. Retention rates were higher than ever. Applications for jobs at the bank had doubled, with top candidates drawn not only by the paychecks but by the reputation. The new culture wasn't about tradition for its own sake. It was about dignity, fairness, and growth. Simone adjusted the microphone on the podium set up in the boardroom for the bank's first annual Community Impact Summit. The room was filled not with directors in tailored suits, but with clients, community leaders, small business owners, and employees. A nervous buzz filled the air. This was a new kind of gathering for the bank, one that opened its doors to the very people it once ignored. Change, Simone began, her voice steady, resonant, is never comfortable for those who benefit from the way things have always been. But change is essential for institutions that want to survive in a world that refuses to stand still. The room quieted completely. Every eye was on her. I didn't return to this position to seek revenge, she continued. I returned because I believe deeply that financial institutions carry responsibility. Responsibility to serve all people, not just those who've been told they belong. Responsibility to open doors, not keep them locked. Responsibility to show that dignity is not negotiable. Applause broke out strong and long. But Simone lifted a hand gently, calming the room. She wasn't finished. Over the last 6 months, Liberty First has invested $50 million into community development, education, and entrepreneurship programs. Loans to minority-owned businesses have increased by 400%. First-time homebuyer mortgages in historically redlined neighborhoods are up 250%. And perhaps most importantly, customer satisfaction leads the region. Faces lit up around the room. Small business owners nodded, remembering the doors that had opened. Students clutched notebooks, inspired. Employees smiled, proud to be part of something larger than paychecks. These changes, Simone said firmly, weren't about being politically correct. They were about sound business. Recognizing talent where it exists, expanding opportunity where it was denied, and proving that when you broaden your definition of who belongs, you expand the possibilities of success. In the audience, Marcus Rodriguez sat taller, his new title of Vice President of Community Development gleaming on the badge clipped to his suit. Sarah Kim had been promoted to Senior Trust Officer. Dr. Amamira Hassan now headed the International Division. The very employees who had stood by Simone when the board tried to break her now sat in positions of power, shaping the bank's future. Simone's eyes found them one by one, and she allowed herself a small private smile. Loyalty had been repaid with opportunity, but the story of Liberty First wasn't just about growth. It was about accountability. Blackwell, Thompson, and Patterson had each faced consequences. The investigation had uncovered emails, correspondence, and decisions that painted a clear picture of discrimination. Blackwell had been forced to resign in disgrace, stripped of his honorary titles, and later sentenced to 6 months in federal prison for banking violations uncovered in the review. Thompson's career collapsed. No institution would hire him with his name attached to such scandal. Patterson avoided prison but lived under the shadow of permanent professional ruin. Their downfall sent ripples through the industry. Other institutions, seeing the cost of discrimination so plainly displayed, rushed to revise policies, diversify boards, and protect themselves from becoming the next headline. What began as one woman's fight had become a movement. Simone's voice grew stronger as she leaned into the microphone. Some of you know what it feels like to be told you don't belong, to be told to lower your expectations, to be told to find somewhere else to dream. But I am here to tell you today, you belong wherever your talent, your courage, and your persistence can take you. The question is not whether you are worthy, The question is whether the institutions around you are worthy of your contribution. The applause this time thundered, rolling through the room like a wave. People rose to their feet. Employees, clients, community leaders, all united by the truth in her words. She paused, letting the sound settle, then delivered her final thought with deliberate calm. Every person who walks through these doors, whether as an employee, a customer, or a partner, deserves the full measure of respect. We will not negotiate dignity. Not today, not ever. The cheers shook the room. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes. But Simone only stepped back from the podium quietly, her eyes scanning the room, her heart steady. Later, when the summit ended and guests filtered out, Simone returned to her office. The once intimidating space now bore her imprint. Photographs of families in their first homes, framed thank you notes from entrepreneurs, snapshots of employees at promotion ceremonies. And on her desk sat a letter in neat handwriting, from a young Black woman who had just graduated with a finance degree. Dr. Washington, because of your courage, I'm not afraid to demand the respect I deserve. You showed me that belonging isn't something I need to earn. It's something I already have the right to claim. Thank you. Simone read it twice, then placed it in a frame beside her father's briefcase. It was a reminder that her victory wasn't just about numbers or profit. It was about people. About rewriting what power looked like in rooms that once denied it. And as night fell over Chicago, lights glowing across the skyline, she understood the truth. The attempt to erase her hadn't ended her story. It had only given it the power to change everything. The winter wind pressed against the tall glass windows of Simone's office, carrying with it the noise of a city still alive long after the workday had ended. She stood at her desk, gathering her notes into neat piles, the rhythm of small, ordinary movements grounding her after months that had been anything but ordinary. On the wall hung framed front pages from national newspapers, each chronicling what the world now called the Liberty First reckoning. But Simone rarely looked at them. The pages weren't her measure of success. Instead, her eyes always drifted to the framed letters that had come pouring in, handwritten notes from students who now believed a career in banking was possible, thank you cards from families who had closed on their first homes, messages from small business owners who had survived because loans were finally within reach. Those voices meant more than headlines. They were the reason she had walked back into the fire when she could have walked away. 6 months after the confrontation, Liberty First Bank had become something new. Federal investigators had completed their review, and the consequences had been sweeping. Blackwell, Thompson, and Patterson had each been held personally liable. Blackwell had faced sentencing for regulatory violations, Thompson had been barred from holding executive roles, and Patterson, once so comfortable hiding in paperwork, had faded into professional obscurity, his name a cautionary tale in law journals. Their downfall wasn't just punishment. It was precedent. Other institutions across the country took note, forced to examine their own boards, their own cultural fit excuses, their own quiet discrimination. The regulators had changed policy too. New rules required diverse representation on bank boards. Federal oversight of employment practices had tightened. Companies that once treated diversity like a public relations slogan now saw it as a legal and financial necessity. And in classrooms at Northwestern, Harvard, Wharton, Liberty First Bank was now a case study, proof that fighting for dignity wasn't only moral, it was profitable. But for Simone, the victory wasn't about policies or profits. It was about moments. Like the day she walked into the branch lobby and saw a young Latina teller training new hires with confidence instead of fear. Or when she handed the keys of their first home to an elderly Black couple who whispered that they never thought a bank would say yes to them in their lifetime. Or when she promoted Marcus Rodriguez to vice president and saw the pride in his mother's eyes as she hugged him in the atrium. One evening, as she prepared to leave, Simone paused by the elevator, the same one she'd stepped out of on the day the board tried to erase her. She remembered the cold words, "You don't belong in our boardroom." She thought of how close they came to making that lie permanent. But then she thought of the employees standing by her, the crowd chanting her name, the regulators arriving, the moment the truth spilled into the world. She realized then that her story wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told to lower their gaze, to wait their turn, to shrink themselves just to survive. The elevator chimed, and as its doors slid open, she caught her reflection in the polished brass. No longer someone waiting for permission to lead. No longer someone carrying silence like armor. Now she was something else. A mirror for everyone who needed proof that resilience could outlast arrogance, that truth could outshine tradition. Weeks later, she was invited to speak at a packed auditorium at Northwestern. Students filled every seat, others standing along the walls. Faculty sat in the front rows, journalists scattered through the back. The room buzzed with anticipation, the way it always does when a speaker carries more than words. They carry lived history. Simone stepped onto the stage and adjusted the microphone. Her voice, calm but certain, carried through the space. The story that began with 4 words, "You don't belong here," was never just about me. It was about a system that told too many of us the same thing. But let me tell you what I've learned. Belonging isn't something handed down by gatekeepers. It's something you claim, and once you claim it, no one can take it away. The auditorium was so quiet it felt like breath itself had paused. She continued, "Some of you will walk into rooms where no one looks like you. Some of you already have. You'll hear the words not a fit, too aggressive, or too different. Don't mistake those words as truth. They are fear disguised as tradition. And fear cannot be allowed to govern opportunity." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the young faces staring back at her. "I was told to leave quietly. Instead, I stayed loudly. And because of that, change came not just for me but for the institution I led. That is the power each of you carries. The choice not to shrink. The choice not to stay silent. The choice to demand dignity." The applause that followed was thunderous, rolling like a tide. Students rose to their feet. Some shouted her name. Others simply stood with tears streaming, their hands pressed together in respect. Later that night, back in her office, Simone placed her speech notes beside the letter that meant more to her than any award. A simple message from a young Black woman who had written, "Because of your courage, I'm not afraid to demand the respect I deserve." Simone read it once more, then looked out at the city lights. In boardrooms across Chicago, in offices across America, new battles were beginning, quiet and loud. But she knew the truth now. Every time someone refused to bow, every time someone recorded injustice instead of swallowing it, every time someone stood tall despite the weight of tradition, the world shifted a little further toward justice. She turned off the lamp, locked her briefcase, and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, carrying her downward, but she didn't feel like she was descending. She felt like rising. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't revenge. It's simply refusing to move from where you know you belong. And in that refusal, the revolution begins.